And here we are for an exploration of affect theory, right? And this is a post-structuralist response to the counter-reductionist explorations of emotion. And remember this term reductionist, that is, we try to reduce emotion to a small number of variables, a simple explanation that applies across the widest variety of situations and observations. So the notion of reductionism is an idea that robs us of the fullness of a phenomenon. So we have to approach the laboratory study of emotion by reducing it to its components. Right. When I tried to prime emotion in the laboratory, right, I'm trying to prime 4 emotions. The context is extremely narrow by flashing images on a screen, right? I'm reducing emotion to this little tiny aspect of emotion, which I can successfully manipulate and measure in the laboratory, at least hopefully, right? So the post-structuralist response then is to counter, because what's Ekman about when you talk about emotion? He says, well, emotion is designated by universal facial expressions, and basic emotions are everyone is trying to reduce emotional experience to this pithy little statement that attempts to explain as much as possible, right? Structuralist accounts tend to biologize emotional experience, and we see this with Darwin, we see this with Ekman, and we see it with others. And these accounts do so through the limitations of the structure imposed through language. That is, if we're going to write a paper, we have to use language to write that paper. If we're going to design an experiment, it's designed on the basis of the tools, that is, the words that we have to create it, right? And we like a simple, precise, and monolithic interpretation, because it adds to the reliability and the validity of our experimental literature. Right? We have to define our terms, and as we define our terms, then we're robbing them of their breadth and we're making them more and more narrow. So affect theory explains our social experiences in the social world as not exclusively socially determined, but a big dose of biology as well. So let's start with Tompkins. Affect theory broadly refers to the state of being rather than manifestation or interpretation as emotions. So we kind of strip away this label emotions and think about this and why this might be fair to do so. How many times now have we tossed out a word, a label, and said, is it an emotion? And then we begin to debate. Well, I don't know. It's an emotion. It's not. Is love an emotion? Or is it an act? Right? But notice that if we don't start adding structure, if we don't start adding limitations, then we can never move beyond I don't know, right? And we can go back and forth on it, right? So rather than deal with these emotion labels that we've used, maybe we can go more towards that it's an aspect of us and it's part of our being. So affect, for Tompkins, is the qualitative expression of the quantity of a drive's mental energy. So we're going to channel a little Freud here, right? We've got mental energy that fluctuates in intensity. Now, the intensity is one aspect, but the quality, the nature of it, is a different aspect, right? And affect then is the qualitative expression. And this gets us to allow for positive or negative affect at a very minimum, because that's the quality of the affect. Is it positive or is it negative, right? So you can see Tompkins is clearly kind of channeling Freud. He's advancing the psychoanalytic account of affective experience, very similar to what we talked about in Freud. But he was, dissatisfied with the centrality of Freud's drives, and that is kind of the narrow aspect of it, and also putting drive at the center of existence, right? Because Tompkins points out, or at least advances the idea, that drives in themselves can be rewarding. That is the nature of being driven, right? And notice, we're talking about a psychology of a being to a greater extent. So as I'm experiencing a drive, that is, my state of being is in a state of drive, that can actually be pleasurable. Have you ever been driven to do something that you enjoy, right? And so that drive itself, that anticipation, if you will, can be rewarding. And drives are tied to motivational states, and that gets really tricky, and it really kind of stretches terminology in a bunch of different directions. And if you want to explore that more and get to some solid definitions, then you probably want to take psychomotivation in the spring. Okay, it's typically offered in the spring. So Tompkins' hardwired affect systems, then, they're hardwired, they're biological, and their evolutionary legacies, they're subject to social forces. So note that now we can start thinking in terms of, the individual organism, right, is embedded within this element of social forces, which include culture, include relationships, but from the inside we have drives, and Kurt Lewin would love this model because it is kind of a model that's amenable to physics as well as biology. So the social forces, via motivational narratives, their scripts, right, interact with the affective experience. So we have the change in affect and intensity. Affect increases, decreases, and we have the ability to experience affect according to Tompkins qualitatively, and that is positively and negatively. But where does the emotion come from? Well, the emotion, now we're getting to the point where we look at the emotion is a label. It's a cognitively generated label to describe that combination of intensity and quality of the affect and the change in the stream. Now, Tompkins says then we have these hardwired systems that operate, I guess, essentially as drives in a certain respect, right? So, and we can see Tompkins got 8. So he's got interest, excitement, enjoyment, joy, surprise, startle, distress, anguish, disgust, contempt, anger, rage. Shame and humiliation is not one that most of our folks have picked up on, and fear and terror. So you can see there's a lot of overlap with a lot of basic emotion systems we've described, but Tompkins is putting them as hardwired systems within us. Okay? So affected then by the narratives or scripts. So the scripts arise are modified by ongoing experiences. So often we find ourselves in a situation, we feel a certain way, and we say, oh, this situation is like X situation that I've experienced previously, or maybe someone else had told me about, and then that modifies my affective experience. Right? It's not just cultural scripts. Culture certainly operates as a hidden hand, but notice we have a powerful memory system, and this allows us then to record our individual experiences and operate from those as well, use that as information. Now, the downside is, and those of you who've taken human memory, or remember even from Psych 1100, memory is easily distorted and is relatively unreliable. So, responses and affective and emotional experience, if you want to keep those separate or together, right, it can be very idiosyncratic. And this is, then again, says, hey, you reductionists, you social psychologists, especially, who go into the laboratory and you try to paint a picture of emotional experience in humans on average, you use random assignment to filter out the idiosyncratic noise of your data, right? So we are super reductionist as social psychologists in understanding emotional experience, much to the horror of post-structuralists, right? So evolving to manage our social experience in potentially very unique ways, and that's where the idiosyncrasy comes in, and it kind of challenges especially social psychological investigation and explanation of emotional experience. So we get to Damasio's somatic markers. Remember that? Past experiences influence one's emotional flavor. That is, what's happening is we have stimuli that is tagged with, in accordance with emotional experience, right? And that facilitates the subsequent emotional experience or re-experience. That it's almost got like a head start through these historic linkages, through, Ed Damasio would use the term somatic markers. So result of Tompkins' affect systems then, where do we go with it? Well, determinism diminishes an explanation for emotional experience. So actually this is somewhat liberating because determinism is being set to the side. Free will becomes possible to a greater degree, right? And affective contagion can be viewed in yet another way. It can be affected by the narration of our own inner life. So when we discussed emotional contagion, and we kind of said that it was a fait accompli, that it was going to happen regardless, that it was deterministic. You're with this group of people, you will take on their emotional states. Freaking not necessarily. So let's look now. Let's look at just a pattern of interaction. You smile, they smile. Now, they smile it can do a couple different things. They smile, you might perceive that as being rewarding, right? And that reinforces your smile and makes you more likely to smile in the future. And that would be a straight up behaviorist account. But if we take that diagonal arrow from they smile, that might then stimulate memory of your own idiosyncratic experience, right? And that might then, in fact, increase or decrease the reinforcement of your smile. And then finally, the last step is the activation of the physiological and neurological components of joy. So there's a lot of perceptual process that's going that finally activates the neural response, so to speak, or the neural consequence of those perceptions. And now, couple bottom line aspects then. As we move away from the structure that's imposed on us, and we move away from reducing these phenomenon to things that are amenable to study in the laboratory, we're kind of allowed greater freedom and we're rewarded with a more idiosyncratic experience of emotion. And that is, your history matters. And your history is used to explain the changes in the affective stream, the changes in its intensity, and the changes in its qualitative nature, positive or negative. And if you want to read more on this, which I know you're probably dying to do, there's Affect, Imagery, and Consciousness by Tompkins. And if that's good enough for you, then you can go to Volume 2. Or you can buy a complete edition, what have you. I'm not selling his books. I've not read any Tompkins directly. My reading list is so damn long that I got to be somewhat choosy. Now, let's talk Deleuze and Affect and Deleuze. He offers a cultural human geographic account of affect. Affect is ever active, flowing from one state to another. Okay? So the affective stream never stops. As long as you're alive, affect is operating, right? And it changes in the quality and the intensity. It flows. Now, Deleuze is tying this to the increase or decrease in power. And who the hell does that sound like? Who is big on power? And if you're saying Spinoza, you are right on the money, right? So affect is always in the state of becoming. It's not fixed in its identity. That is, it's always morphing, transforming, and it's always fluctuating. It's like a stream of energy, if you will. So affect forms into preformed emotion categories. That is, okay, this combination, and this combination of affect, right, if we just want to look at it as a 2x2 kind of dimensional aspect, then once we get to a certain point within that 2x2 matrix, we say, this is this emotion. Or when it gets to this point, we go, this is this emotion. Now, not quite that simple, right? But at that point in time, it becomes fixed momentarily. That is, we have our affective experience, we slap the label on it. At that moment in time, it is what it is. But it's ready to change, and it's ready to change almost instantly. And that's one thing that we should carry with us in our definition of emotion, be it reductionist or frickin' not, is that emotion is a relatively short-lived phenomenon. Right? And this is this dance we play because I'm imposing a structure on our thinking. Right? We put that chart up and we say, hey, emotions, right? We had expressions, we had emotions, then we had moods, etc., and then we have chronic dispositions and or disorders. That's a structure, right, that Ekman was imposing on our understanding of time as it relates to emotional and affective experience. Right? So, another structure. We can't be without them, but with structure, the important thing is to step away from them, step outside them, step above them, wherever you want to place yourself so that you can look at them as a relative outsider to the extent that that's possible. Right? So affect might be conceptualized then as action potential, best represented by a verb rather than a noun. And this means that affect probably escapes representation, right? And when we talk about potential, we are going in the Wayback Machine. And who was the one who brought us potential? And remember, that was part of Aristotle's narrative. And this is affect then, and let's put this together. Affect is this ever-changing stream of intensity and quality. We can label it an emotion at a given time based on our idiosyncratic experience and the analysis of the context in which we're operating, right? And we can fix it for that moment in time with an emotion label, right? But the affect itself probably escapes representation. And let's take a look at what's possible here. I love this picture. A Few Seconds from Happiness is a great title, and that's the structure that I imposed upon it. But what if I change the structural account? Because this guy looks like, what do you think? Is he a father? Is he an uncle? Is he a brother? What if I said A Few Seconds from Horror and told you that that man was a psychopath? Either account is potentially legitimate. So the structure, the narrative is what makes the difference, right? And so we need to move beyond this, because stereotypically we could say, oh yeah, A Few Seconds from Happiness. But I think it's important that we're able to generate alternatives as well, to not fall prey and mindlessly adopt a structure that may be habitual and idiosyncratic to us, or might be foisted upon us by a culture at a given time. Now, Deleuze used this example of separation of body and social meaning and forces, and I don't know if you've ever seen the movie or read the book Lawrence of Arabia, but what we have here is a British soldier, Lawrence, who's sent to Arabia during World War I, and his, the British government is saying, hey, go see if you can unite the Arab tribes against the powers of Germany and Turkey, right, in the Middle East during World War I. And Lawrence is a dynamic individual, and people kind of warm up to Lawrence quite easily, and he does then effectively become a leader of the Arab people. The British get pissed off at him, though. His bosses get pissed off because he's going to help the Arabs fight for their own independence, and that's not why the British sent them there. They sent Lawrence to get the Arabs coalesced so that they would have a fighting chance against the Germans and the Turks, and then once the Germans and the Turks were beaten, then the British would just resume their power in the Arab communities. Lawrence, once he met the Arabs, was not going to go that way. At one point, Lawrence is captured, and he's captured by the Turks, who are known for their excessive brutality. Now, if you are a 1920s social psych program and you needed to find a group that you could negatively stereotype for your participants, you would have stereotyped the nasty Turks, right? And we're like, what? Yeah. So what happened? Well, Lawrence is captured. He's gang raped in the desert by the Turks. And I'm going to give you a trigger warning here. If you don't want to hear the story of rape, then you need to go fast forward past the next two slides, right? Lawrence is captured. He's gang raped in the desert. During the brutal torture, Lawrence's body has an erection. And this is a physiological response, right? That could be the result of prostate massage or whatever. Let's not go too far into that. But the deal is, there's no reason that Lawrence wants to appear aroused, but his body is betraying him, right? The body is an autonomous entity at this point. It's beyond his control. Lawrence's experience of shame is due not to being raped, but to the experience of arousal during the rape. But this is physiological arousal. It's not a cognitively supported phenomenon. So the shame is an idea as well as an emotional experience. Lawrence views himself as powerful. His body let him down. It's the assemblage of these constituent parts, all these little component parts, that cause the experience of shame, the resultant emotion. And notice, this is the combination of idiosyncratic experience. It's the cultural concomitance of being a man and all these other aspects, right? And not being a victim, etc. So from Lawrence's account, you ought to be ashamed, a bodily weakness which made my animal self crawl away and hide till the shame is past. So the mind reacted to the body as the first witness, and the mind is first witness to the body, right? The mind is affected, the mind is impassioned as a result of the physiological experience. So for Deleuze, affect needs to be understood through context rather than individuated and abstracted emotion labels. So it's not something to be deconstructed emotional experience, but emotional experience is something to be appreciated for the entirety of the context. So, the role then of selection and perception becomes all important. Perception is a snapshot. Perception is an explanation of our current experience, right? It's a snapshot of the virtual, and because then at that point it becomes actualized. It's a snapshot then of a slice of time and space. We can't ever select the whole, right? And Gestalt psychologists talked about how we kind of assembled the whole, but we see the problems with that. So I love this wheel, and we're going to spin around the wheel real quick here. What we have, and this is our life, 24/7, right? 365, from the moment we're born to the day we die, right? We have some level of goals, motivation, and emotion. Right? Based on our goals, motivation, and our emotion, then we selectively attend to certain aspects of our environment. The simple formula is we can't pay attention to everything because it's overwhelming. There's too much information. So we have to select out a certain amount of information so that we can negotiate our world. And then our goals, motivation, and our emotions also allow us or affect the way we interpret what we have selected to. So we select this portion of stimulus because we can only process so much, and my interpretation is affected by what I need or what I want to do or how I'm feeling, right? And this then feeds into memory, and this is the encoding simplification part, working memory if you will, but also preparing for long-term memory, that is the storage aspect. And then memory is the fodder for cognitive or behavioral output. That is, we retrieve memories in terms of thoughts, images, or behavioral memories in terms of action sequences. And that affects then our goals, motivation, and emotion. So it's this selection process that becomes fascinating in this regard, and this is what causes those snapshots. But notice, what's selected and how it's interpreted is idiosyncratic, right? It is up to this moment in time. So I want to stop here. We'll stop and we'll go to part 3. We're gonna